Jewish Education in Media is pleased to present L'Chaim, a program that highlights the people, issues, and events of importance to the Jewish community. Now here is your host, Rabbi Mark Golub.
I'm Mark Golub, and very often I have the great pleasure of introducing you to men and women who are making a major contribution to the Jewish community and the Jewish future. And every now and then, I have the privilege of sitting with extraordinary individuals who are making a contribution not only to the Jewish community, but to the American scene as a whole, people who are having an invaluable impact on both the nature and the quality of life in our country, and how lucky we are on this edition of L'Chaim to be able to sit with a man who is making a most remarkable contribution of his own. He has already a history of service on the college campus, in the American justice system, and he may most well be known to some of you from his days as the extremely popular president of Brandeis University. It is an honor to welcome to JBS Professor Frederick M. Lawrence, who today is a distinguished senior research scholar at Yale Law School. Let me tell you a little bit more about Fred Lawrence. As a renowned constitutional scholar, Fred is one of our nation's leading experts on civil rights, free expression, and bias crimes. Again, he served as president of Brandeis from 2011 to 2015, when he often attended large Shabbat dinners, often delivering himself the Devar Torah, and actually leading Kol Nidre on Yom Kippur. Prior to his becoming president of Brandeis, Fred Lawrence was dean of the George Washington University Law School, and in the 1980s, he served in the Attorney General's office for the Southern District of New York, where he was chief of its Civil Rights Unit under Rudolph Giuliani. But perhaps most important of all, Fred Lawrence has been respected and beloved everywhere he served, and longtime Brandeis Professor Jonathan Sarna said of Fred Lawrence, "There has never been a president of Brandeis so well liked by students." I told you off camera, it is such a thrill for me to be sitting with you, and I am very grateful for the time you're giving us.
Thank you, my friend. It's a pleasure to be here.
Good. And you know what JBS is.
I do indeed.
And L'Chaim. We were talking before we went on the air. You were in the green room.
Right.
And it was, I love the fact you recognize someone whose picture is in the green room because you sang with him. What's the story here?
I sang with Peter Yarrow.
Where?
Now, it was not just Peter, Paul, Mary, and Fred. Let's be clear here. I sang with the New York Choral Society for 4 seasons when Kathy and I first moved to New York. In my youth, I was a relatively serious singer and sang in a variety of groups, and then we lived in Manhattan, sang with the Choral Society. Once a year, we did a holiday concert with Peter, Paul, and Mary.
Really?
The same way that many ballet companies use the Nutcracker as a way of taking care of packing the hall.
Yes.
We had Peter, Paul, and Mary. Our conductor, Robert DeCormier, had known them very well, and by one story, it helped introduce them. So they did a concert with us at Carnegie Hall.
How old are you when this happens?
Oh, I guess I'm in my mid-30s.
Okay. Was it a kick to sing with Peter, Paul, and
I
Mary?
have to tell you, it was beyond words. I will tell you, well, you know from Peter, but the late Mary Travers and Noel Paul Stuckey backstage are exactly what you'd like to think they would be. Good people, decent people. And in fact, Peter wrote Light One Candle, now a very popular song, for that concert with the New York Choral Society.
Really?
As only Peter Yarrow could. He said we were doing very serious, terrific Christmas music and fairly, I think the technical term is shvach, Hanukkah music. And somebody said to him, then write something better. He said, I will. And he came into the stage and he said, here's something I've worked up. And we rehearsed Light One Candle, and from the moment we started singing it, you felt chills up and down your spine.
Isn't it a fabulous
Oh, it's a great song.
Yes.
Great song.
And, you know, look, there's something very cute about I Had a Little Dreidel.
Right.
But it doesn't compare to Silent Night.
Correct.
and then Peter Yarrow writes "Light One Candle," and you feel, like you say, there are chills from that song.
And it speaks to the entire hall.
Yes.
Right? It speaks to the Jews in the
Yes,
hall, it
yes.
speaks to the non-Jews in the hall, because it takes the immediacy of the Hanukkah story and it makes it universal.
So, Fred, where were you born? Where did you grow up?
I was born outside New York in a town called Port Washington on the north shore of the island. My parents were among those couples who got married during the Second World War. My dad worked on the Manhattan Project.
Wow.
My mom
No.
taught high school. Yeah, he was one of the young engineers on the project.
In Los Alamos?
No, he was here. He was
In
in
New
the,
York.
he was based in the Woolworth Building.
Okay, which was called the Manhattan Project.
It
That's
was-
why it was
that's
called,
why it was called
the Manhattan Project. What was his name?
Joseph Lawrence.
Okay.
I will tell you that a story that made more to me as I got to be a big kid, because when you're a kid, you grow up with your parents' stories. Those are the stories, right? Then when I got older and I realized that my parents, when they got married, were just in their 20s. And my father had been working on some defense-related work. That project was over. He got his draft notice. Before he showed up for his physical, he got a notice to appear to the Woolworth Building. And he was hired, came home and told my mom, they had me doing nonsense work, silly work, because his clearance hadn't come through. Then his clearance came through. They told him what the project was. He came home that day and he said to my mother, and at this point they are 26, 27 years old, essentially newlyweds. He said, now I know what I'm doing. I can't tell you, and you're not to ask me.
And she respected that?
She respected that, and on August 6, 1945, she was home on vacation because she was a school teacher. He called her up and said, did you hear? And she said, I heard.
This is Hiroshima.
This is Hiroshima. Did you hear? And she said, yes. And he said, that was it. And that was the first time she knew what her husband had been
That's
doing
amazing.
for all those years.
At any point, were you able, as a young adult, to talk to your father about the atomic bomb and Hiroshima and Nagasaki?
I'm glad to say I was. He was not one of those who didn't want to talk about it. He was very open about it. I think he felt very clear about Hiroshima, a little less clear about Nagasaki.
Meaning he supported Hiroshima.
Correct.
And he did not support nearly as much Nagasaki.
Correct.
Yes.
I think and in fact it affected him deeply because he became very suspicious of the military-industrial complex thereafter, and as an engineer, tailored some of the projects that he did or didn't work on that basis.
Okay, just quickly, where'd you go to high school?
Went to Port Washington High, called Paul D. Schreiber High
No
School.
kidding.
Public high school in Port Washington, New York, where my mother was the chair of the English department.
Okay, rah. And then where do you go to college?
Went to Williams College and Yale Law School, where I'm privileged to be back now.
Okay. It is remarkable to have a father who worked on the Manhattan Project. And I asked you, how you think he felt about it. And you have this long history in both constitutional law and in civil rights work. Did your father's work or did your father's background either influence you in any way? Was there ever a reaction by you to it? Did you ever feel, I love my father and I understand why, but I'm uncomfortable, as some people have become, with Hiroshima? And I'm just curious whether any of this happened to you.
Yeah, it's a good question. I wouldn't say that it was a reaction to it. I mean, my father was very progressive in his view of politics. He told us, he quoted Einstein. I don't know if Einstein actually said this, but my father always quoted Einstein as saying we were on this earth for the benefit of each other. Mm-hmm. And that's the way we were raised. Mm-hmm. What he did say about the project is that he and many of the people he worked with deeply believed that this weapon would be so awesome and so awful that it would be the end of war for all time. And he would then go on to say that when Korea happened and other wars happened, Vietnam, that he was so mortified that in fact war hadn't ended. But in some ways, of course, it did, in the sense that we never again saw that kind of worldwide calamity that we saw in the First and Second World War. Mm-hmm. So in some ways it was that.
Okay. Do you have a problem with it?
I think the use of the weapon when there could have been other ways of doing it, it's hard to second guess, but I have to say the destruction and the sheer loss of life now is hard to conscience. It seems to me certainly the time between Hiroshima and Nagasaki could have been used to think more about how that could have been done.
Okay, and in some way, of course, we're looking at this in the second decade of the 21st century. What happened it wasn't even 1950.
Correct.
It's in the first half of the 20th century. And I wonder if it's fair. And I really would love to hear this from you, because this in some way plays into your being a constitutional lawyer. And the whole discussion of the Constitution is always, are you a strict constructionist? Are you loose constructionist?
Right.
Is your job to tell us what Thomas Jefferson said and meant then? Or are you trying to tell us what would Thomas Jefferson do now were he living in the present time? So there's something analogous there. To what extent do you feel the criticism of Hiroshima isn't really fair because it's such a different time today?
I think I feel that part keenly. I mean, I would give you two examples that for me always capture the immediacy of it. One is that my uncle, my father's brother, was D-Day plus 10 or 15 going into Normandy, and his unit was then decommissioned after the end of the European theater, brought home, and they were going to be recommissioned for an invasion of the mainland of Japan. So this was not abstract to my father. This was his brother who had survived going through France and into Germany, who would be one of the potentially million casualties, which was the number they used. The other story he told, which I'll try to make brief, but it captures it, was his description of what they said on the project during the Battle of the Bulge. Battle of the Bulge is the winter, December, January of 1945, and it made no sense for the Germans to have a holding action that inflicted so many casualties on the Allies, but also enormous casualties on the Germans, and couldn't possibly have been successful. It couldn't have been successful. There was no rational reason behind it. Now, of course, the reason that there was no rational reason behind it was a madman running the Third Reich. But that wasn't the first assumption that they made. So they're looking for a rational reason, and my father said the only rational reason was delaying it by a month must make sense. Mm-hmm. What would they need a month for? They must have been close. Mm-hmm. They must have been close to having an atomic weapon of their own. Mm-hmm. And if they did, Germany was actually way ahead of us in delivery mechanisms. They had V1s and by then V2s that were going right into London. Mm-hmm. So the fear that's hard for us, I think, to capture of what they were living with suggests to me that we should be a little careful about going back and second guessing.
Okay, I find it a fascinating discussion. I thank you for being so honest with me. And what about your Jewish education growing up? How Jewish was your home? And, what's been the trajectory of that?
My parents were founding members of a Reformed congregation, community synagogue in Port Washington.
With Gene Borowitz.
With Gene Borowitz, who was the rabbi at my bris.
No!
Gene was a very important person in my life.
Wow.
Just passed away, but one of the really, truly great figures in Reform Judaism and in American Judaism.
Yes. And, I am one of those who benefited enormously from Gene, and I was the first assistant editor of Shema magazine, and I was a big student.
I was a student fellow at Shema magazine. We may have been there at the same time.
Maybe.
I was there the 80-81 year.
No, I was gone already. That's why we didn't. But that's terrific. So we both have a real connection through Gene, and that is lovely to hear. Okay, but anyway.
So Gene played an important role by then in the founding of Community Synagogue, and was a close family friend for years. By the time I came of age, Martin Rosenberg was the rabbi. Rabbi Rosenberg was a formative figure in my life.
And I studied with Martin Rosenberg. So these are people who I had intimate knowledge and contact, and it gives me chills.
Then his view of what Reform Judaism is that one had to have access to text, one had to have knowledge, one had to be able to access sources, and then you made choices.
Okay, but you're a kid at this time.
I'm a kid, but at the same time, I'm a kid who by the time I'm 14, 15, is finding some mentor figures who are taking me seriously intellectually.
How lovely.
And he's one.
Okay, that is unusual, is it not, Fred?
It is, but at the same time, the world was alive with ideas. This is the late '60s, early '70s, and it's an exciting time to be thinking about how one affects the world, and it's an exciting time to be thinking about ideas and how they change the world.
Okay, but I give you a lot of credit. Most 14-year-olds weren't where you were.
Well, I'm also the youngest of three, so I had two older brothers, and as my mother would say, I always wanted to play with the big boys, so that was part of it.
And tell me about Kathy.
Kathy and I met when we were both at Yale. I was at Yale Law School, and she was an undergrad at Yale College. We were actually introduced by the late Arnold Jacob Wolf.
It's incredible. Who was a dear friend of Gene
who
Borowitz.
I met through Gene.
Yeah.
And Arnold changed my life. I gave one of the Hespids at Arnold's funeral. Arnold was the Hillel rabbi at Yale, played a very formative role in Kathy's life and in my life. And we met at Yale Hillel. This is the classic nice Jewish kids meeting story, but it is our story.
That is fabulous. And how many children do you have?
2 children. Our daughter Miriam is a fiction writer and lives in Brooklyn. And our son Noah, who graduated from NYU Law School a year ago, is now living in Jerusalem, which is on the lead edge of making Aliyah. He is studying at Brandeis right now and thinking about what comes next, but he is a fervent Zionist, and we are very proud of him.
Okay. So I mentioned in the open that when you were the president of Brandeis, you are involved in the campus Jewish life. And very often, you know, and I'm not telling you something you don't know. Very often the president is, the classic phrase is the ivory tower, but is aloof, is separate. Very often there's a discord between the, quote, administration and the student body. And you're known for bridging the divide and for being close to your students. But more than that, you are taking part actively in the Jewish life at Brandeis. Where does that come from, Fred?
I think it comes from my sense of how education is supposed to function, that I went to a small liberal arts college, not a large Jewish population, but as a result, we had to take responsibility for our own Jewish life. But I saw models of outstanding teaching at Williams College. The expression used at Williams that President Garfield, who was a Williams grad, said about Mark Hopkins, one of the storied presidents of Williams College. He said, education consists of Mark Hopkins on one end of a log and a student on the other. And that notion of being engaged and being involved is how I taught at Boston University and even at George Washington University when I was dean of the law school.
You were also teaching
I taught a section of criminal law, which met 3 days a week, and I had to grade the exams, and it was a real live section. When I was at Brandeis, I taught a seminar. It met 1 day a week. That was a little different. But even that, I did teach a regular seminar. So part of this is to be involved in the life of the school. But the Jewish life of Brandeis, to me, was important, I used to say, for 2 groups of students, the Jews and the non-Jews. It was important for the Jewish students for perhaps the obvious reasons of allowing them to experience themselves both Jewishly and as part of a major research university. But for the non-Jews from all over the world, students from well over 100 different countries at Brandeis, to be part of an institution where it is open to all, where it is a non-sectarian institution, but where the norm is to be Jewish, where the calendar is to be Jewish, where the president does do Kol Nidre. Where Friday night I would be on campus. If I was not traveling, I'd be on campus and always go to Kabbalat Shabbat on campus. And we would fairly regularly have Shabbat dinners at the president's house. Mm-hmm. And I would tell the dean of students who organized these things that I always want a mixed group. I don't want it to be only Jewish kids. I said, but you do have to make sure that in any given group, there are enough kids who know the way around the Shabbat table. So it's not me putting on an act. That's not good for me, but it's also not good for the kids who are there. Mm-hmm. So that the kids who are there can really experience what it means to be part of this kind of an institution. Mm-hmm. I'll give you an example. Please. That you're gonna feel the same chills that I do every time I tell this story. Young woman, graduate student in psychology, cognitive psychology, with a cross around her neck, comes to dinner Friday night. Comes up afterwards, and she's got English is perfect, but she's got a fairly thick French accent. She is from France, and she tells me that her father was Jewish, but never talked about it. Now, I think we understand the shadow of the Shoah on this whole story, given her age and given the generation her father would have been a little older than I am. And she said, being in your home for this dinner, this Friday night dinner, I understand him better than I ever did before. Oh. Now, is that why she came to Brandeis? Who knows, right? Who knows?
But wait, have you ever heard somebody say, the problem is Brandeis is too Jewish, and I don't want my child to go to a place that, he's grown up with Jews, right. He goes to Hebrew school, he goes to the youth group. When he goes to college, I want him to have a broader experience. If he goes to Brandeis, he's going to a form of collegiate ghetto. What would you say to that?
I would say it's actually for most of those kids exactly the opposite. If they go to most other schools, particularly if they want to keep a Jewish identity, then they actually are going to be ghettoized because they'll be with their Jewish group of friends. Brandeis, they can have a deep, profound Jewish experience, but be part of a student body where, the truth is, of the American students at Brandeis, it's only roughly half, a little more than half, who are Jewish. Mm-hmm. So it is an incredibly diverse experience, which is where you have the experience of students from all backgrounds having Jewish friends for the first time, and observant, dedicated Jews having a much broader experience.
Okay, look, you taught law at BU, right?
That's right.
Then you're at George Washington University as a dean of a law school. Right. Then you end up as president of Brandeis. You've seen no fewer than three. You were at Williams.
Yes.
And then you were at Yale.
That's right.
So you're aware that at the moment, one of the things that concerns the Jewish community is the BDS movement, especially as it impacts college students. I want to have your sense of where the BDS movement stands in general, and then you have been proud about the fact that you created something called the Brandeis model.
Right.
Talk about BDS in general, and then explain what you mean by the Brandeis model.
I think part of where BDS has been successful is that they have been able to, by dehistoricizing the conflict, and I'll say in a second what I mean by that, dehistoricizing the conflict, they tell a story, a narrative of the Middle East that is very appealing to the American ear. It's a story that goes like this. All we're saying is that everyone should be treated the same, one person, one vote, there should be no religious distinctions, one country for all peoples, and whoever carries the vote in the government gets to govern. To the American ear, that's very appealing. And what's the alternative to that? We're having religious tests and distinctions? That's not very appealing. That doesn't sound very American, right? So I think they have been very successful in presenting a view that has no understanding of Zionism, of what Jewish nationalism is about and where it fits into the scope of nationalisms worldwide. Anyone who wants to question the whole concept of nationalism, that's a fair argument. I would ask, why are we starting with Jewish nationalism? There are a lot of other countries where we might start. And anytime someone focuses only on the Jewish aspect of some general question, I'm allowed to be suspicious as to what's driving that. Mm-hmm. Having said that, from the other side, I think that we have not always been as good as we might be at making the case for Israel. And making the case for Israel in the terms of not just being a reaction to the Holocaust, but a legitimate expression of nationalism of the Jewish people, which goes back a half century before the Holocaust or 20 centuries before the Holocaust,
Absolutely.
depending on how you wish to start counting, right? Mm-hmm. You can start it in 1898 or you can start it several thousand years BCE.
Yes, you can. By the way, we have somebody running right now as we're taping named Gil Troy, who is giving a lecture. He gave it, I believe, at APAC. And his whole point is he is disturbed by the Zionism of Theodor Herzl. Not that there's anything against Herzl as an individual, but he points out that the Herzl view of Zionism is it's because of anti-Semitism. The Jew will never be at home anywhere. The Jew is persecuted, whether it's in Poland or Russia or Western Europe and France. And that ultimately the reason there should be a homeland for the Jews is they deserve a place where they won't be persecuted. And Gil Troy's position is that's an element of why there should be a Jewish state, but it is only a small element, and that what we really should be doing is celebrating what you just talked about, the historic connection to a people working out their own sovereignty and their own national identity in a homeland of their own. And it goes it not only goes beyond the Shoah, it goes beyond anti-Semitism.
Right. Look, perhaps the single best example of the success of Zionism as a project is the rebirth and recreation of the Hebrew language. It's a stunning event, unique in the annals of human history, that a language that was an ancient language and only a study language, really, our prayer language, becomes, in the scope of history overnight, the language of people from all over the world.
Absolutely.
Remarkable experience.
There may be some young Jews who don't understand. At one time, Hebrew was the Lashon Kodesh. You only used it, prayer book, synagogue, Torah, but you never were even permitted to speak it. And then here comes the state of Israel and Eliezer ben Yehuda.
Right.
And he creates a modern application of biblical Hebrew. And as you say now, there are Jews all over the world who speak Hebrew. And when I was a kid, it was all Ashkenazic Hebrew. Because Israel chose the Sephardic dialect, the entire Jewish world has moved towards a Sephardic pronunciation.
Right.
And when you were growing up, were you already taught Sephardic Hebrew?
I was taught Sephardic Hebrew.
Okay. Have you been to Israel? Do you have a connection to Israel?
Oh, yeah.
And your son is there now.
My son is there living in
And
Talpiot.
he may make Talpiot. He may be making Aliyah.
Correct.
How will you feel about that?
Very proud of him. Very proud of him. And it's a place that, look, would I prefer that he live across the street from me?
Yes, I know.
If it's not going to be across the street from me, I would rather him be living someplace that's important to him, important to us, and maybe just say someplace that's important.
Okay. Can you now, by the way, you didn't talk about the Brandeis model.
So, thank you. So what we tried to do at Brandeis, and I think we're able to do with great success, was to, I won't even say combat BDS, because that becomes the after effect, right? The goal is to make the case for Zionism in an affirmative way, in a direct way, but then also have a broad discussion and a broad level of engagement. So one of the hallmarks was something called BView, which is an acronym for Brandeis Visions of Israel in an Evolving World. Visions, plural.
Was this your idea?
This was a student project. In fact, it was a group of IDF veterans, young men and women who had served in the IDF, who then came to Brandeis, along with some American students, who came up with an idea that they wanted a broader discussion of Israel, and they saw quickly that I was supportive of this. In fact, I will tell you that I told them, I'll raise you some money for this, but here's what I expect.
And what did you expect?
What I expected is that we could have a forum for an open discussion of Israel.
And forgive me, what's it mean, an open discussion?
Yeah, it means left, right, and center, but it means that certain things we take as given, which is to say the legitimacy of Jewish nationalism. Now, within that acceptance, there's a wide range for discussion.
Absolutely, but not everybody accepts it, and you already made that point.
And even with that, I will tell you that I had a discussion with a group of students involved with BView and the broadest ranges of BView, because I met with them about once a year. And a young woman who was pretty far to the left said to me, I don't feel comfortable talking about the Nakba, the Arabic word for catastrophe, for what they call the creation of the State of Israel. I don't feel comfortable talking about the Nakba on this campus. And I paused and I said to her, obviously you do. You just did with the president of the university. And the walls did not come tumbling down. So what you really mean is that you think I'm going to disagree with you. And I do. And you don't like that. That I can't help you. Right? Free expression.
To what extent, in what way do you disagree with her?
The idea that it is a catastrophe in the sense that there is a place for a Jewish homeland.
Oh, the student who was talking to you, she felt that the word Nakba applied to something in a correct way?
That's correct. And she felt that she couldn't talk about that on campus. And I explained to her, you can. This is an open campus and an open forum.
Pushback.
But you're going to get pushback, and that's okay. Mm-hmm. So I think that by not excluding expression, by not making it impossible for kids to express different views, what we were able to do was to have a broad discussion, and the center of gravity was a strong center of gravity that recognized the role of Israel and recognized the legitimacy of Jewish nationalism. As a result, students who weren't sure were not defensively supporting a BDS position. That's the side that's the underdog. That's the side that's being suppressed, so I'm going to support that. Nobody was being suppressed. There are no underdogs. What there is a level playing field. Mm-hmm. And so my deep belief is that in a fair and open discussion, Israel does just fine. Mm-hmm. I'll give you a couple of other examples of how this worked. I was able, with the collaboration of my good friend Charles Bronfman, visionary philanthropist, to come up with a project to incentivize faculty to work in collaboration with Israeli academics. The idea of this initiative was that there was seed money for scholars doing research in any field. Best idea wins. Doesn't matter what the field is, with one condition. It had to be in collaboration with an Israeli partner. Now, obviously, what I'm betting on is if they spend time working with an Israeli academic partner, what's going to come out of that is a deeper sense of what Israel is about, a depoliticized sense of what Israel is about. Israel is not a conflict. Israel is a country. If you get your news just from certain outlets, you think of Israel as a conflict. Israel is a country. It is a culture. And the best way to pierce through that is through human engagement. So we increased the number of students coming from Israel, scholarships for IDF students, scholarships for Ethiopian students from the Amin Ord community that you may be familiar with, changing the campus through engagement. If their sense of Israel is what they hear from the president talking from on high, it's only going to go so far. If it's a student across the hall, if it's the person you share a lab bench with in chemistry, if it's somebody you play soccer with in intramurals, it changes the discussion. It humanizes the conflict. And that, to me, is the essence of the Brandeis model, is to have the doors wide open, know what you stand for, there's a core that you stand for, but to be based on human engagement.
Oh, Fred, I love the way you do it. I love your articulation. By the way, you were successful for a long period of time, correct?
Highly successful. There were, as I say, many views expressed on campus,
But there was no real BDS movement. But
No.
I apologize to the audience if any of you don't know the phrase BDS. It's boycott, divestment, and sanction attempts in some way to undermine both the cultural and economic well-being of the State of Israel. Many people believe BDS is really an attempt to destroy the State of Israel. And so what you're hearing Fred describe here is the extent to which he brought on a totally different approach to the way in which Israel should be discussed and understood and treated on the college campus. Since you left, has there been a change, or do you feel that Brandeis still has been successful in dealing with Israel in such a way that BDS is really not a reality?
I think the core of Brandeis will always be the core of Brandeis. I certainly hope that's what my successors will do. You know, the way these things work, you get your chance, and then it's the next person's chance. But it does seem to me that that's a core piece of what Brandeis is about. You know, when people would say to me, "Well, what does it mean that Brandeis? You know, it's not exactly a Jewish school, but it's a Jewish school. What does that mean?" Right? So usually it's described best in stories than it is in sound bites. But I would say that we were the one campus, the one place outside of the State of Israel where, without being 100% Jewish, it was normal to be Jewish.
Yes, right? That's lovely. By the way, you went to Williams. Was it Mary, right? Did you apply to Brandeis?
No, I applied to Williams' early decision.
And why?
You know, my late brother went to Amherst, Williams' arch rival. We used to say the reason the Amherst-Williams rivalry is so intense is because nobody else in the world could possibly take it seriously except for people from those two schools. The middle brother went to Cornell, so I had a chance as the kid brother to have seen both a small liberal arts college and a big research university. And I will tell you, from one foot set on the Amherst campus, I was smitten. And
really?
I knew I wanted to go to a small liberal arts college. And then, you know how these things work. It can be quite coincidental. I wound up going to college during the very brief period of time, I think 2 years, 3 at the most, when Williams was co-ed and Amherst was still single-sex. We went co-ed a little before Amherst did. Had I been 2 years older or 2 years younger, I probably would have tried to go to Amherst like my big brother. But as it is, I went to Williams, and you know, now I bleed purple.
Very, very nice. I want to ask you a question based on your understanding of constitutional law as it applies to the Israeli model. First, one of the principles that our country is founded on, it expressed through the Bill of Rights, is the notion of free speech, freedom of assembly and freedom of speech. And the question is, how far does that free speech extend? And we know the Justice Holmes limitation, but most people don't understand that it's a very sophisticated discussion within the constitutional world of what is included or excluded in terms of free speech. And many Jews were very upset when in Skokie, Illinois, the Supreme Court of Illinois said that free speech extended to the Nazi right to march through a survivor community in Nazi uniform. But at the same time, those who were committed to the notion of free speech understood that that was what America is. Given your understanding of what America means by free speech, what's your reaction to the Israeli phenomenon where Israeli citizens are celebrating the Nakba, which again is a Palestinian expression that the state of Israel itself, of which they are citizens, is a catastrophe and they don't want it to exist. There is a party within the Israeli Knesset comprised of Arabs, and they also celebrate the Nakba, and they often talk about the end of the state of Israel. And I want to know from you, as both a Jew, somebody committed to the state of Israel, and a constitutional expert. And I know Israel is not America.
Right.
At the same time, if you were to bring a perspective, and you're not God, you're not going to make the law, but if you were in a seminar in Israel with other constitutional lawyers who was talking about this issue from a theoretical perspective, what would your position be? And is seditious free speech? Is sedition covered under free speech? Or, Fred, do you feel at some point there is a line of which, whether you live in America or any Western democracy, including Israel, one should not cross that line?
Well, there's a 3-hour answer and there's a 3-minute answer. Let me start with the 3-minute answer, and then we'll see where we go from there.
It's a fair question.
Oh, yeah, it is. It is clearly this is a fair question. This is a fair book topic.
Yes.
So let me start with a story that goes back to the mid-1990s. I was privileged to be invited to speak at a conference at Hebrew University on violence-conducive speech, not violence planning speech. I mean, everybody understands that there are certain limitations on speech, to be sure. Conspiracy is not protected by the law. Imminent incitement of a crime.
Imminent.
Imminent incitement, and under the American constitutional system, imminent means quite imminent. That is, that's a here we go kind of thing into a crime. That can be prohibited. But that's pretty far out in terms of what can be prohibited. This was a conference on violence-conducive speech. Now, why was it at Hebrew University? Well, it was on roughly the first yahrzeit of Prime Minister Rabin. And so clearly, the topic was motivated by not speech that literally threatened the life of the Prime Minister, which everybody understood could have been restricted, but speech that created a culture, a climate of violence. You'll recall at that time there were those who were calling him a rodef, right? And the Talmud tells us that a rodef, a pursuer, is someone in whom as to whom one can use self-defense or defense of others, but must. That is correct, that you must use deadly force if deadly force is being used.
Use as much force as necessary, including deadly force.
Correct. So that was very difficult language, and it was violence-conducive language.
And I'm sorry, are you part of this conference, or you're just telling us a story?
No, I was one of the speakers at it.
You were, okay,
The speakers were Americans, British, Germans, and Israelis.
Where were you in your career at that point?
I was at Boston University. I was a tenured professor by then. Okay. And I had, my hate crimes book had not yet come out, but I'd begun writing a fair amount about free expression and the limits and challenges of free expression.
So you were there as an American constitutional expert.
Correct.
Speaking about the issue of free speech as it applies to violent speech that incites violence or a climate of violence.
Correct.
Okay.
It will not surprise you perhaps to know that the Israelis and the Germans had more in common with each other than either did with the British and certainly the Americans, because of course the Germans and the Israelis are the two modern legal systems that have grown up in the shadow of the Shoah. One of the German scholars said to me after my paper, where I talked about that even violence-conducive speech ultimately in the American system is and should be protected. And he said to me, if there were brown shirts on Fifth Avenue throughout the 30s, you would have a different view of this. And I said to him, you're right. My view of the First Amendment is not a trans-contextual, universal view that says the same system ought to work in every place. There's a law in Germany today that you cannot display a swastika. You cannot display Nazi paraphernalia. That's against the law. That is not against the law in the United States. And whereas I do not think it should be against the law in the United States, I completely understand why in Germany it is. Will it be in Germany 100 years from now? I don't know. That'll be an interesting question for them to wrestle with 100 years from now. So now to come to your question about Israel, it seems to me there are fair and good arguments for a system of free expression in Israel that would be robust within an Israeli context, but not as extensive as the American context. We are privileged by the environment that the history of America provides, and therefore I think we are responsible to have a broad First Amendment protection. But that there are limits, certainly, that an Israeli government would be able to create. Now, having said that, I would want to make sure that you start with a presumption that free expression is broadly protected. I wouldn't necessarily look so much to Oliver Wendell Holmes, who I think got it roughly right, but sometimes for the wrong reasons, but for his very good friend on the court, one Louis Brandeis, who was a brilliant First Amendment theorist. And Brandeis, who understood that part of the whole notion of free expression is it is how we relate to our national government, to our local government, to our society. It's who we are. Mm-hmm. And so we cannot stifle free expression, even the expression we most abhor.
Okay. Am I correct that seditious language is not protected under the Free Speech Bill of Rights?
Depends what you mean by
in America.
By seditious language. Language that criticizes the United States today?
By sedition means I am preaching the overthrow of the United States.
If you are organizing the imminent overthrow, that is not protected. But if
you've got to be organizing the imminent. So you're telling me if I am simply holding rallies,
yep,
in which I am trying to persuade my audience to overthrow the government of the United States, that is protected in America.
Correct.
By free speech.
Correct.
And no policeman should come in and stop me.
Nope. And you wouldn't want him to.
No, but I understand. Okay.
Because what you would want instead is for those views to be expressed to the air, and let's see how they do. Because what happened in Skokie, people forget the punchline of Skokie. So not just the intermediate court, but the Supreme Court of the United States ultimately affirmed the right of the Nazis to march in Skokie. And when they did, they were, as should have been predictable from the beginning, a pathetic group. And they were vastly outnumbered by the counter-demonstrators. And I completely understand why Skokie did what they did, and the fact that those are survivors, like every one of them is a tzaddik, everyone who survives. So who am I to tell them what they should and shouldn't feel? That said, the city officials of Skokie should have understood that by denying the Nazis the right to march, they gave the Nazis the only victory they could have gotten. Because on any of the merits, any of the issues, they would lose. The only issue they won on was free expression.
Okay. What do you think would happen if a member of the Senate or House got up on the floor and said that, as tragic as it is, 9/11 was merited, and gave some reason why the United States has been an oppressor, has brought death and destruction to parts of the Islamic world, and therefore 9/11 was a just attack on the United States. And this is a member of Congress, a member of the House, or the member of the Senate. Would the United States tolerate that? Instinct.
My instinct is that person would have that shown corner of the nation to corner of the nation within minutes, and would barely be able to make it to the next election before he'd be out.
Yes.
And that's
if he made it to the next election.
And that's the right way for him to go.
Okay.
But could Israel have a different rule? Could Israel say,
Yes,
for example,
yes,
that Meir Kahane should not be able to be in the Knesset because of racist beliefs? I would not want my United States Congress having that view, but I would accept my Knesset having that view because I believe free expression is different.
I would not. I think that's very different than a member of the Arab community who is an Israeli citizen being elected to the Knesset and then arguing in the Knesset there should be no state of Israel. It's a much finer issue to define what racism is. And you and I agree that as painful as it was for the survivors in Skokie, it was the appropriate decision. And Jews benefited in the long run from that decision, both on the Illinois court and on the Supreme Court. And I don't want the state of Israel deciding that it doesn't like the rhetoric of somebody who is arguing for the state of Israel's right to do this or that, telling this person you can't be in the Knesset. And we have, by the way, the Israelis have tolerated Arab Knesset members who have preached the end of
Correct.
Israel. And so I don't share your view on Kahana. And I think Kahana is much more subtle and complicated than has been made out to be.
Well, my view is not so much that I think that they would be entitled to exclude him. Strike that. My view is not so much that I think they should exclude him. It's that the
Kahana.
Knesset, right?
Yes.
Or for that matter, one of the Arab members.
Yes.
It's that if they chose to do that, I think it's a different question from what happens in the American
Okay,
system.
develop that just a little bit more because it's fascinating to me. And there's something that I'm very much sympathetic to, that there is something so simplistic about any nation, in this instance Americans, looking at other countries in the world and assuming they must be like us and they must even express democracy as we express
Right.
it, when the reality on the ground is so different for the people who live there. I find that a very sophisticated argument, and I wish more people expressed it the way you do, but develop it more for me.
One of the reasons that we do a lot with comparative constitutional law on some of these issues with students is that there's a temptation to think that if you don't handle a particular issue the way America does, it's because you're not really a democracy. An issue like hate speech, something I've worked on a lot, which we do protect in this country, and in my view, believe we should, up to but not including the point of actual threats and actual terroristic language or threatening language, not language that hurts people's feelings, that's going to be protected, but language that literally puts someone in a state of fear, that's something different. But other than that, we will protect hate speech. But the British don't, and the Danish don't, and the
you think
Germans
they're
don't.
right also?
I think they're right for them.
I don't know, by the way, I don't know if that's true. You should excuse me. For you, I don't know if for some reason you ended up a professor of law at Oxford and you became part of the, you got up in the morning and you walked the streets in England of whatever community you decided
Right.
to live in, that you would still feel that somehow the England was just to limit free speech in ways that you would never want America to be.
Well, it's funny that you use the English example because I gave a paper at University College London where I was a senior research fellow a while back. And I was talking about these very issues of hate speech. And one of the members of the faculty says to me, suppose that a group of skinheads got a truck and painted it up with racist slogans and drove it right into the heart of Brixton, a community that's largely African and Caribbean. Would you prohibit that? And so I began to lay out how I would think about it. I'd need to know more about what it is they were trying to do. Were they trying to threaten somebody? Or were they trying to express their own views of racism? I'm halfway into this explanation when he stops me and says, why is this so hard for you? We all know it's wrong. And I said, that's why it's hard for me. Because to the American ear, we don't all know that what somebody else thinks is wrong. Right?
Very well
We
said.
don't think that way.
Good for you.
And I think that's the difference. So,
Okay.
were I British, how would I come out?
All right. Because you're a constitutional lawyer, I want to know how you feel about two issues in the little time we have remaining.
Sure.
First, the way the discourse within the Jewish community and the polarization in the Jewish community has become more and more both severe and in some way, Fred, nasty. And this is something you've written about and talked
Right.
about. Give me just a sense of where you feel, and I'm really limiting it now, within the Jewish community. What do you see and what concerns you?
Yeah, what does concern me is a sense that we have largely lost the ability to disagree in an engaged way, which is to say that if we disagree about certain issues, it's not enough to disagree, we have to pulverize one another. And I think we have experience with this as a people, right? This is what happened at the time of the Second Temple. And it's a very bad ending. And we have to know that at the end of the day, what connects us is infinitely more significant than what separates us. And there simply has to be a way of being able to disagree agreeably is sort of a thin version of it. I mean something more than that. I mean to understand that I don't question your bona fides. I don't question your sincerity when I say I disagree with your conclusions, and that we have to be able to share that together. That to me is the essence of what Hillel and Shammai were about.
Yes, it is such a Talmudic concept that both this position and this position are the words of the living God, meaning they both have
Right.
legitimacy, and by the way, both are preserved, And there's a notion in the Jewish tradition that perhaps the minority position today could become the majority position later on. That's not the tone
No.
of debate in the Jewish world today.
And so we know that at the time of the of that particular dyad, within the rabbinic period, that there was no sense of Hillel and his followers delegitimizing
Correct.
Beit Shammai. Quite the contrary. And I think we should look to that as an important lesson.
All right, the last issue for you. As a constitutional lawyer, I have you at this table. And I want you to know what Alan Dershowitz said to me. And then I want to hear what you would say.
Okay.
There may be no more critical constitutional issue on the American scene, whether it is in court or whether it's in the air. The constitutional right for a woman to have an abortion. The Roe v. Wade decision, which legalizes abortion in the United States. And there are many people now in America who are opposed to abortion, and certainly opposed to abortion at any time. And there's always a question as to whether Roe v. Wade should be, quote, overturned or not. When I spoke to Alan Dershowitz about this, his argument to me was, had he been on the Supreme Court, he would never have voted for Roe v. Wade, although he is absolutely in favor of an American woman's having the right to seek an abortion. And he basically said, however, the way it was determined by the Supreme Court had no basis in constitutional law. I mentioned earlier, there's the strict constructionist and the loose constructionist. I didn't ask you, where do you see
Right.
yourself? But in some way now you get a chance to speak to that. I want you to speak about the general issue, strict or loose. And, Fred, if you were on the Supreme Court of the United States, would you agree with Alan Dershowitz, or do you feel the Supreme Court, by creating the concept of privacy and permitting a woman to have an abortion, did something so important that you would have gone in that direction as well?
Well, let me answer both questions. First, in terms of where I put myself on the spectrum, I wouldn't say loose construction, but I think, to use the term that Justice Breyer has been using, it is a constitution of active liberty, in my view. It is one that requires interpretation, that the founders themselves had that in mind. The founders were extraordinarily gifted people, but I think they certainly understood
Didn't they?
that the
Yes.
world was not to stay fixed in 1787, but that it would change over time.
Right.
The very use of terms like cruel and unusual punishment suggests it has to be looked at over time. Due process of law, that these things will have to evolve over time. So I think there certainly is a role for the evolving notions of liberty as we go forward.
And by the way, hasn't the Constitution evolved from day one, and that really this is a distinction without merit? The only question is, where do you want the Constitution to go?
Correct.
Because there's always interpretation. And even those who argue strict constructionism, there are areas in which they don't want the Constitution of the 18th century to be the Constitution that operates in the United States. Okay, but
on the
now,
abortion issue,
Roe v. Wade.
I think I see where Alan is going, and I'll tell you where I differ from him, not completely, but
Please.
significantly. I think that what the court did in Roe against Wade got the country to the right place, but it got it there by a route that was ultimately very destructive, by moving too fast. And if you want a good example of where it worked the right way, I think the way in which same-sex marriage was recognized by a court that had let, as it were, more facts evolve, let more argument evolve. Now, there were still some who said they moved too fast, and that seems to me is an argument that will go on, forever. But Justice Kennedy, I think, got that one right, in terms of sensing that where the public was, and now we're not going to ask other people to wait more for their rights to be recognized. The problem with a view that says the court has no business in this is we could easily have wound up in a situation where, depending on which state you live in, you do or don't have this kind of a right recognized. And at certain points, there are certain rights that are so fundamental that we do say those are national rights. Those are not local rights. We fought a civil war over what it means to have a national state with national rights and what it means to have national citizenship. And I think that right of privacy is properly enshrined there.
Nice. So you would see the right of privacy in the Constitution?
Correct.
Okay. And just from your own perspective, if I were to say to you that to be an American citizen means by right of citizenship, you have the right to be fed, clothed, housed, and the right to be taken care of in terms of health. Would you agree or would you exclude health?
Well, even all of those, I wouldn't say those are constitutional rights. I think those are rights that we feel that a good society
Yes.
ought to be providing. And so
All four?
All four. All four. Yeah, I think a civilized society attends to its citizens and their rights and their needs to be free of fear, free of want, have certain freedoms, including the right to believe, to speak, a right to health, and a right to education.
You know, you've got to be heard everywhere, and you've got to write, and you've got to be at this chair as often as you possibly
I
can.
would be delighted.
You are so marvelous, and you know you bring both thought, real sophisticated thought, and you bring a heart that is so wonderful. And again, our first meeting, but I am absolutely
Pleasure.
totally in love with you. And
Thank you,
kol
Mark.
hakavod to you, and kol tuva hatzlacha. You should only go from strength to strength. And I mean it. I really hope whenever there's an opportunity, you'll let me have you in this chair, and we'll just continue talking about whatever's going on in the Jewish world and on the American scene.
I will look forward to it, and perhaps we'll even get a chance to talk about a New York Knickerbocker team playing in the playoffs.
Very nice. That should happen before the Messiah comes.
Amen.
The thoughts of Fred Lawrence, right now distinguished senior research scholar at Yale Law School and the past president of Brandeis University. And again, it is just so wonderful that we here at JBS can bring this kind of individual to you so that we all can learn. And you know, I always say at the end of the program, if there's anything you want to say to Fred Lawrence, please, you email me and I will send it on to Fred. So please email me, write me, post on our Facebook wall, or tweet me. I look forward to hearing from many of you. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. L'chaim, my friends, to life.
L'chaim is a presentation of Jewish education in media.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, with a tax-deductible gift of $36, WWII or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to Jem, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.